All
So,
right. Well, why don't we get started? I'm David Haynes. I'm one of the former co-leads of the Wisconsin Alliance for Civic Trust. And I say former because, as most of you know, we've turned over management of WisACT to the Whitburn Center at University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. Sam Larson, the interim director, is here with us today. This will be the last meeting that I actually facilitate and run, but I'll continue, as will Scott, on a volunteer basis to work with WisAC. We're very excited again that Whitburn and Sam and the crew there in Oshkosh is going to be managing this program. We think there's just great things that we can do with it. We're joined today by the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, or WIPS. That's a unit of the Universities of Wisconsin. It dates to 2007. And its mission is to educate and engage residents of our state, develop future leaders, and help communities it serves meet their needs. WIPS is based in Wausau. Presenting today will be Eric Giordano, who's the founding director of WIPS. He works with university and community partners to address key policy issues using community-based solutions. Eric also co-leads a national project on the future of rural communities, a really important issue
Hey,
as
Lisa.
well.
Hey, Shelby.
Um,
I decided that I'm going to apply to present at the
the
big NASPA conference.
with the Kettering Foundation and other national partners. Eric's joined today by the program manager at WIPS, Julie Bunczak, and Sharon Belton, the senior public policy fellow. So with that, let me turn it over to Eric and your presentation. Thanks so much for being with us today.
okay, thanks. Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. Glad you're here. I had a little minor face surgery, so I'm going to go off camera here in a minute. And plus, we have slides, so that way you can focus on the slides. So anyway, we've done introductions. And so today we're going to be talking about Let's Talk Marathon County, which is a project that we sort of developed here up in the north central part of the state. We're going to talk about the background and motivations for the project, a little bit about the methodology, which is public deliberation, and then the process. And then Sharon's going to present some data that we collected based on the results of our dialogues. We'll talk briefly about next steps and then open it up for questions. So next slide, please.
Eric, just one quick point of order. We are recording the session and we'll post it to our YouTube channel within 48 hours. So just so all of you are aware of that, it's being recorded. And also, if you have some questions, feel free to raise your hand using the controls at the bottom of the screen or put your question or comment in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. Go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
No, so David kind of introduced us. So we're part of the Universities of Wisconsin. We're known right now as WIPS. However, we're rebranding in the fall as the UW Office of Civic Engagement. And within our structure is also the Wisconsin Institute for Citizenship and Civil Dialogue. And I mention that because this project was done under those auspices. I'm not going to get into what we do. You have the slides or you can collect them later, or ask us later. So if you can switch slides, Sharon. Okay, let's talk. What was the catalyst? We had a conundrum in 2021 back when a lot of communities were considering passing non-binding resolutions around being more welcoming, communities safe for all. Today, that would kind of fall under the moniker of DEI and is being kind of ripped out of communities and universities and things. But at the time, that was kind of a big deal. And it kind of blew up rather suddenly, where some people really thought this was necessary, living up here in rural central Wisconsin, where some people of diverse backgrounds didn't always feel comfortable. But at the same time, people who've been here for many years thought that this was unnecessary. Unfortunately, the New York Times kind of came to town, picked up the story to two articles, and of course, no offense, David, but kind of portrayed the worst parts of the problem and kind of missed the nuance. But if you can switch slides, Sharon. And so we wondered after the fact, after it had already blown up, after people had already got their opinions solidified, after people were done with the yelling and screaming, what could we have done differently? Could we have intervened in some way to make a difference? And it's ironic to me that we're talking with a group of people whose literal, job or mission over the past couple of years has been to do exactly what we were trying to do. So thank you for your leadership there. So we ended up applying for a grant by the New Pluralist. You can see the website, newpluralist.org. I'm not going to go into a lot of who they are, but it's kind of interesting, I think, reading if you want to check it out. One interesting thing is multiple funders, and they also are politically diverse. Their focus has been on pluralism. There were 800 applicants for this grant, and 32 awards were given, and we were awarded $400,000 for the Let's Talk project. So this is what was motivating us and our project. Can the public discuss challenging and emotionally charged issues in productive and civil ways? Can we change the narrative, or could we have changed the narrative in situations that are cast as us versus them, good versus evil, etc.? And then our essential research question is, can we impanel a representative group of residents to engage in a constructive dialogue and help de-escalate wicked problems? And then finally, which we're kind of working on now, is will community leaders see a role for this type of dialogue in our community in the future? We can go on. Now, our chosen methodology, our approach to this civil dialogue project was something called deliberation. Some people call it deliberative dialogue. Some people call it public deliberation. But basically, deliberation is a nationally known methodology for civil dialogue. It's practiced literally in every state in the country. Of course, people have different versions of what it means, but basically it means actively listening to people you may not agree with and seeking to understand why they feel that way. These are structured dialogues, so the issues are framed in a way that allows participants to weigh the costs and consequences of potential actions. And then finally, deliberation, at least as we are practicing it, involves a process for uncovering common ground. Now, sometimes there isn't common ground, but that's useful information as well, and ultimately to potentially negotiate potential solutions. So to sum up, deliberation is a kind of talk that encourages responsible decision-making. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
All right, so our goal was to create a panel of 100 residents of Marathon County that had a political breakdown of 30% conservative, 30% liberal, 40% moderate or middle of the road. And in order to recruit those folks, we, used a lot of different avenues, emails, social media, print advertising, radio PSAs. We wanted to make sure that we had both urban and rural voices included. So we did print ads in rural newspapers, including in Spanish language, which I'll get to again in just a little bit. Next slide, Sharon. And we received 260 applications and invited 120 of those people to confirm their interest. And we ended up with 94 confirmed panelists. Now that number 94 has fluctuated a little bit because some people have moved away, others have been added under special circumstances. And rather miraculously, we ended up with almost exactly that 30-40% breakdown that we had been hoping for. We also prioritized the urban-rural demographic as we were creating the larger panel, and other demographics certainly came into play, but we really wanted, it was those first two that we really prioritized when we were making our final choices for who would be part of the panel. So I mentioned that we did a Spanish language ad, and we knew from the beginning we wanted to include the ever-growing Hispanic community in Marathon County as part of this project, but there were going to be some special circumstances here. So we did get a group ultimately of 22 participants, and they participated in the immigration dialogues that Sharon will talk about shortly. Like I said, there was a lot of more work that went into getting this group together. So they actually didn't participate in our first two dialogues, but they have met since we've done the immigration dialogues and have been, talking about topics that the rest of the group has been talking about. Part of the issue here was through the print ad, I think we got maybe 3 applicants. So we really needed to work with, people we know in that community who did one-on-one recruitment. And that group does not have the political diversity that the full panel does. Almost everybody in this group identified themselves as middle of the road, so their results get reported separately. And we need all our materials to be translated, so that's like extra time and effort there. Okay, next slide. So once we identified the people who were going to be participating in the project, the next step was to find out what the issues were going to be that we wanted them to be discussing. So we surveyed Marathon County leaders to see what they thought were the top issues of concern, and they landed on youth mental health, homelessness, and childcare. And then the Let's Talk team, kind of discussed that we really need some slightly more hot button topics to really test out our theory here about how can we get people together to engage in dialogue around controversial issues. So we've added immigration, voting and elections, and gun rights and safety as to round out our 6 total topics. So we have 6 to 8 dialogue sessions per issue, and we hold those dialogues in person at locations throughout Marathon County. We do make an effort to reach, slightly outside of the Wausau area for the more rural folks, so they don't have to come all the way into Wausau. And we also hold virtual events on Zoom. And each session has 10 participants. And again, we are going for the 3-3-4 breakdown in terms of political balance. And we've been really very successful in getting those numbers. But the groups of 10 are not the same from issue to issue. There are just too many variables that we can't control for in terms of people's schedules and locations and whatnot. But what does end up happening kind of organically is that people do end up overlapping quite frequently. For instance, there's a group, we always hold sessions at the Marathon County Public Library in downtown Wausau, and they're always held during the day. And at any given session of 10, where we've got 10 people, probably at least 6 of those people have seen each other in that context before. And it's kind of unexpected to see how there are connections being made, as people are coming in or as they're about to leave, where they're connecting with people that I don't think they would otherwise be making connections with in any other setting in our community. Next slide. So we have held 35 individual dialogue sessions on 5 issues so far, and you've got the whole breakdown on the number of dialogues and the number of participants. We have engaged the Spanish language community in the immigration and the childcare dialogues, and they will be also part of the gun rights and safety dialogues that will be happening this summer. Okay, so what does each of these individual sessions look like? So we have 2 trained moderators who lead a 90-minute session. And again, ideally, we have 10 participants in each session. Now, sometimes we don't get 10 people to register. Sometimes people have to cancel. Sometimes somebody wants to add very late because they had to miss an earlier one. So occasionally we'll end up with like 11 participants, but that's usually who's sitting around the table. And that includes also an observer who is just silently taking very detailed notes. An important piece, very important piece, is the issue guide. So this is a 6-page document that gives them a lot of information about the issue we're talking about. So we've got, the first page is background information. The next page is statistics. And then we have 3 approaches to the issue. And under each approach, we have 4 to 5 action items. And these action items and approaches are not mutually exclusive. What usually ends up happening is people will like some action items from one approach and another action item from another approach, and maybe more from another. So it's kind of a mix and match thing. But the really key thing here when it comes to dealing with the approaches and the action items is that they need to reflect a variety of core values from across society. And that is because every participant in the dialogues needs to find something in those lists that resonates with them. So next slide. And Sharon will get a little bit more into the approaches. It's listed as an option there on this slide, but we use the term approach more often now. Next slide. And the final page of the issue guide are the ground rules for deliberation. And this is really important. I won't read through all of them. You've probably seen guidelines like this as well. But before the deliberation can begin, everybody who's sitting around the table needs to agree with a thumbs up or a head nod that they will respect these guidelines. And this becomes important because the moderators can fall back on this if people start not exactly observing what they've agreed to here. And the one that comes up most often, people get animated, excited, they start interrupting each other, and the moderators may say, hey, just remember, we all agreed that we were not going to interrupt each other. And that's always worked really well for mediating unexpected pieces of the conversation. Next slide. And other logistical considerations, participants each receive a $100 gift card when they participate in a dialogue. This was a big chunk of the grant that Eric referred to earlier. We really felt we needed to incentivize people in order to get the demographic variety that we wanted. We asked them to participate in at least 4 of the 6 dialogues, and our moderators participate in a 2-day training. So they're really prepared to go into this. Moderators are, I think we've got about 12 people who are doing this. There are many WIP staff, but also people within the community, many of them from the nonprofit sector, the education sector. And in one instance, we had a participant. She was a panelist in the first set of dialogues, and she contacted me and said, "This is great. I've got a little experience in this kind of area. Can I be a moderator?" And she's been a fantastic addition to the moderator team. Okay, and now it's all over to Sharon.
Thank you, Julie. So what I want to do is sort of illustrate, using the topic of immigration, sort of what did we learn from Marathon County Let's Talk panelists about the dialogue process, or the process of talking about immigration, but also the range of views that Marathon County Let's Talk panelists had about how to manage immigration in our country. And so for this particular issue area, we did 8 dialogues last summer in July and August, right as the election season was heating up. And obviously the topic of immigration was, one of the front and center issues in the election. So it was getting a lot of attention in the media, especially in central Wisconsin, because we have a large presence of dairy farms where a number of migrant farmers assist in the dairy industry here in Marathon County. So we did 6 in-person sessions and 2 via Zoom. A total of 53 of the full panelists participated. And as Julie mentioned, we held some additional Spanish dialogues with 17 Hispanic and Latino individuals from Marathon County. And just to reinforce one of the points that Julie made, this particular table shows sort of how we aggregated individuals' self-reported political affiliation into the liberal, moderate, and conservative categories for the purposes of structuring the dialogues. And so the thing to focus on this particular slide are those 2 gold circles. The first one on the left shows the distribution of the full panel by political affiliation. So you could see 29% liberal, 42% moderate, 28% conservative. In the dialogues that we did specifically on immigration, we had almost that exact distribution of 28%, 45%, and 26%. So the information that I share with you today about the immigration dialogues does really reflect a broad mix of individuals with different political views. And despite that, we were able to have some very reasonable discussions about this topic. So as Julie mentioned, we used an issue guide on the topic of how should we manage immigration in our country. And one of the challenges that I think Julie and the Let's Talk team identified early on is the need to identify standard terminology about how are we going to refer to individuals that might be in the country without authorization. So some individuals like to refer to people as aliens, some as undocumented individuals, some as unauthorized individuals. So the Let's Talk team, just to have a standard terminology, use the terminology unauthorized immigrant throughout the dialogues to sort of set the tone for the terminology that was going to be used during the dialogues. And having that standard set of terms was important to help sort of provide a neutral way of talking about what is a very, politically divisive issue. So the 3 overall approaches that the dialogue participants talked about with respect to managing immigration sort of encompass 3 different views about the immigration topic. The first area was like, let's welcome immigrants into our country. Let's be a beacon of freedom. The second one was enforce the law and support actions that are consistent with enforcing the law, but also being fair to those who follow the rules with respect to immigration. And the third overall approach was slow down immigration into the country as a way to potentially manage immigration and instead focus on common bonds. So those were the three broad areas that the dialogue participants focused on. And as Julie mentioned, within each of those three approaches, there were 5 specific action items that the dialogue participants went through. Now, I'm not going to read this particular slide, but this just illustrates for one of the approaches, sort of what the dialogue participants saw in the issue guide and the ways in which they went through the discussion. So just for example, I'll just use the top one as an example. Within this particular approach, they discussed the action item of reducing the number of authorized immigrants that are admitted into the United States each year. And so the moderator would help them talk about this particular action item and then also draw out of the discussion potential drawbacks to that particular approach to managing immigration. So there really was a systematic discussion of these different approaches and facilitated process to elicit individuals' views, either for or against the specific action items. And the issue guide was really an excellent tool to help ground the discussion in some specific policy solutions. So how do we analyze all of this information? We basically include 3 different components to our analysis to help provide information on what was the participants' feedback on the dialogue process itself. Did it help increase trust in their fellow community members about the topic? Did it increase their understanding about the topic? And for that, we use a post-dialogue survey that we administer after every single dialogue. So we have used the same instrument across all, 50 or so dialogues that we've done to gauge the participants' feedback on the process itself. But because we are talking about substantive policy issues, we also want to be able to capture sort of what were the themes that were identified from these discussions that can help inform communities about what individuals' views are on these particular topics that we're talking about. And then we do some periodic interviews and focus groups with the project staff to identify things that we can do to improve the project itself. But today I'm really going to focus on the first 2 rows of this particular table. So the first thing I want to do is kind of give you the big picture of what are some of the themes that we learned about Marathon County Let's Talk panelists' views on how to manage immigration. So the first point that I want to make that we've really found that is consistent across all of the dialogues that we've done across all of the issues is that despite the political diversity of the panel and of the dialogues, there really are areas of common ground that can be identified regardless of the issue that we were talking about. And common ground doesn't mean everybody agrees that one approach or one action or the other is the best solution. Sometimes there can be agreement that they oppose a particular action item relative to a policy area that we're looking at. What we found from the immigration dialogues is that we found that there was the strongest support across all of the 8 dialogues that we did for the action items that fell under approach 1, which was welcoming immigrants and being a beacon of freedom. There was the most opposition to the action items that fell under approach 3. And I'm going to show you a table in a moment that kind of illustrates these points in more detail. There was just more opposition to the idea of slowing down immigration in the country than there was in comparison to wanting to be a country that was more welcoming of immigrants. Overall, across the dialogues, it was very clear that participants really supported a multifaceted approach. And one of the more fascinating things in looking at the notes from all of the dialogues was participants expressed a real concern about the need for immigration policies to be more clear and more consistent and administered more fairly than they might currently be, or at least they were at the time that the dialogues were conducted. So the first thing I want to walk through are just some results of the post-dialogue survey that we do, just to illustrate for you sort of what some of the key points are about individual participants' experiences with the dialogue. So when we ask the panelists, you know, how much did today's dialogue help you evaluate the pros and cons of potential solutions to the issue of managing immigration? About 63% said that their participation in the dialogue increased their, or it helped them evaluate the issue quite a bit or a great deal. So when you combine those two categories together, and interestingly, about 70% of the dialogue participants said that their participation, they observed that there was common ground, either quite a bit of common ground or a great deal of common ground on the issue of immigration based on the dialogue that they participated in. So helped them evaluate the pros and cons. They identified common ground. When talking about some of the dynamics of the discussion, 30% of the participants, or 87% when you combine those who answered quite a bit, said that they valued the input that was provided by the other dialogue participants. 64% reported that participants with differing views in the dialogues acted very respectfully towards one another. So reinforcing some of those key points about civil dialogue based on the information presented in this particular slide. This is really a point that I think is really a key takeaway about the Let's Talk dialogues, is that when we ask the dialogue participants, how confident are you that your community can engage in civil conversations about the issue you discussed? So in this particular case, it was immigration. We had 88% of the panelists said that they were more confident or much more confident than they were before the dialogue that they and their fellow community members could engage in civil conversations about a highly divisive topic like immigration. And we also found that participation in the dialogue made the participants want to be more engaged on the topic of immigration in their communities. So this particular slide just shows some of those dynamics with respect to wanting to be more engaged. More than half, about 57%, said they would want to talk more with their fellow community members about the issue of immigration, either quite a bit more or a great deal more. So based on the dialogue participants' feedback themselves, the dialogue seemed to be meeting those initial objectives that Eric outlined in terms of being able to provide a format for people to talk about issues in a civil way. One of the things we also do is we ask for open-ended feedback, and this is just a handful of examples of the kind of feedback that the participants provided in the post-dialogue survey. And the one I like in particular is the third one, where someone said that even though some of the viewpoints were extreme, I at least felt more aware of those differing opinions. And that particular comment is, I think, illustrative of some of the benefits that the participants have shared about their process of doing the individual dialogues. So now turning to what were the individual participants' views about the different action items to address immigration. Now there's a lot going on this slide, and I'm not going to go through it in this format in excruciating detail, but you can see in the column on the left are the 3 different approaches, and then under those approaches, the 5 different action items that the dialogue participants discussed. And then you could see, you know, the columns 1 through 8, there's different shaded cells to indicate just the overall general level of support for each of those individual action items in each of the individual dialogues. So the key takeaway from this particular slide is to just get a sense of, just looking at the different colors, sort of how did the dialogue participants' support kind of aggregate into particular action items. And this slide sort of provides that aggregated view of all of the 15 different action items that the participants discussed, sort of summarizing across all of the dialogues, what were the areas of common ground and where were there more mixed views about particular approaches to address immigration. So if we look, for example, under the green column on the left labeled support, that first cell, there was fairly consistent and widespread support across all of the dialogues about providing legal residency and the ability to apply for citizenship for dreamers. So these would be individuals that were brought to the country as children by their parents and do not have, current legal status in the US. So even despite the political distribution of the panelists, there was fairly consistent support for providing some type of legal status to dreamers. In addition to that, there was widespread support across the dialogues of the need to reform current immigration policy so that just in general, the path to citizenship is more clear, more affordable, and more easily understood by individuals seeking citizenship in the country. And the third area that had significant support was allowing Wisconsin residents in particular to get a driver's license regardless of their immigration status. And despite individuals' political views, they all were fairly in support of wanting safer roads. And they felt that regardless of someone's immigration status, they should be able to get a driver's license and pass the driver's test without any kind of fear of being reported or deported. So across the 8 dialogues, in that column on the left were really the things that individuals supported. I won't go through all of the items in the opposed category, except I'll highlight a couple things. There was fairly widespread opposition to the policy proposal of basically identifying and deporting those who entered the country illegally and requiring them to reapply. Now, the concerns that individuals expressed about this particular policy decision were the potential for separating families as a result of mass deportation efforts and the resources and the administrative hurdles that would be required to do mass deportation type policy approaches to dealing with individuals who might be in the country illegally. So keeping in mind that, these kinds of policy actions are being undertaken right now in the country, these were views that were expressed by Marathon County residents, earlier in the summer last year, before the election. Similarly, there was consistent opposition to the idea of detaining adults who were entering the country illegally if it meant separating families during the process. So there was a lot of concern amongst the dialogue participants about the potential consequences of particular actions on children and families and sort of what those policy decisions might imply from a resource perspective. And then you have in the middle column, a lot of mixed views about particular policies. On the one hand, many of the participants really felt strongly about the need to have a fair approach to immigration. At the same time, other participants recognized the need to enforce immigration laws and wanting people to follow the rules. So the purpose of this slide is just to try to illustrate how the deliberative dialogues can be used not only to facilitate civil conversation, but also help identify what some of the key themes are about how people feel about particular issues. And I won't go into this slide, but you have it in the handout. We found a lot of consistency between the Spanish language dialogue participants' views of these policy decisions and the full panel. So there was a lot of consistency there between the two sets of dialogues that we did. I'm going to turn it back over to Eric for our wrap up, and then I'm happy to answer any questions about sort of the policy views when we get to that point. But back to you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. So this is really a misnamed slide because these are takeaways, but they're not necessarily the most important. These are really takeaways that we didn't really resolve, or just created some concerns or some challenges for us. So for one, the incentives, like how do you sustain something like this in a community and ensure that you have, adequate participation that's diverse in terms of political ideology, but also other demographic factors. And we thought incentives were really the best way to go. And we know that research shows that they get people to participate. Do we really need $100 per participant? We're not sure because we only tried it that way. But we have tried it in some other instances in previous years with offering $0, and that didn't work as well. So maybe somewhere in between. Not really newsflash. That's a little sarcasm. That it's easier to recruit liberals compared to conservatives. I don't know what the numbers were, Julie, but I think we had at least twice as many liberal applicants self-identified as we did conservative applicants, something like that. This is not news, right? I mean, everybody understands this, and it's even harder when you're part of a university system or you're perceived as part of an established entity that might have some liberal leanings. And so I don't know all the reasons why it was harder, but it's definitely harder. And so you really have to work at it. We can talk more about that if you all have ideas, because I know you had to go through this when you were recruiting or talking to people about, WisACT. We think trained and committed moderators is critical. Now, this is another potential hurdle, right? Because it's not like you can just pick up an issue guide and walk in a room and say, okay, everybody, let's just talk about this. You really need to have people who are ready to understand the content and who are also trained how to deal with disruptions and other things that sometimes arise. We also believe that, we really need to go to the people. I don't know if we did a perfect job at this, but we did not. Did we hold any at the university? I'm not sure we did, but we held them at some public libraries. We held them at a couple of rural venues. Julie, anything you want to add about that?
We did always hold some here, on our campus. But otherwise, yeah, you're right. I deliberately didn't go very far out into the rural corners of the county because then I thought, well, we get like one or two people, but we kept them kind of closer to Wausau, and that worked out well.
And finally, during, I can't remember which dialogue it was. It might have been because we did multiple topics, as Julie said. We did childcare, youth mental health, immigration, and another one or two. Somewhere along the line, we experimented with implementing live polling during the dialogues, which we thought might enhance. It's interesting. I think we said it enhance the analysis of views, but really we thought it would enhance the moderator's ability to understand, okay, where are people on these issues before they've talked about them? And then after they've talked about them, we did another live poll and we saw, and they could see in real time if their views had changed. And that was a cue for moderators to talk about, okay, well, where did we have tension or why did we have a change here, and help the group to come to some better understanding of their own perspectives. We found that for analytical purposes, it actually wasn't very valuable, or maybe a better way of putting it is we didn't have the numbers to support conclusions. So I think we've decided that this could be helpful in some circumstances for the purposes of just conversation, but not necessarily for analytics. Let's go to the next slide. Sharon, can you do the next slide? Okay. And this, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just want you to know that we're obviously not alone. I mean, there are civil dialogue projects going on all across the state, all across the country. I just highlighted a few. I apologize, Sam, because I know there are some happening at UW Oshkosh or some at Eau Claire. The one I want to highlight just briefly is the discussion project at UW-Madison. The only reason I want to highlight that one is because we didn't even know that they were doing this until we were about a quarter of a way through our own project. But when we compared notes, we realized we were doing almost the exact same project. The difference was they were using students as their audience and getting students to come together in these dialogues, but we were using the exact same methodology. We were dealing with residents of a mixed, rural urban county. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But there are other things going on, and we're aware of that, and we know that these are also very valid, legitimate methodologies that can also bring about positive change in our communities. So I think that's about it for us.
Well, thank you. Great presentation, and thanks for the great work you're doing up in Marathon County. It really is the kind of work that we all need to do more of, and it's central to the kind of work that WisACT is trying to do as well. Lori Asbury, you have a question? You want to come off mute and ask it?
Hey, yes, sorry. Thank you so much for all of this. It's incredibly interesting and obviously very, very important. One of the questions I had is just kind of looking at your slide where you list all the different dates of your meetings and then what the responses were over the category. And it looks like there was a slight shift from 710 to 822 potentially. And I'm wondering if you saw anything like that, and A, could you attribute it to what was going on in the greater world? And how would you control for, kind of the uptick in what was going to happen with the election cycle and all the media blitz around these issues? Or did it not impact? Like the guide maybe was the thing that kind of was your control.
It's an interesting observation. I don't think we would have the data to draw any conclusion one way or another about whether variation across the dialogues was being driven by things that might have been going on in the external environment. But I do think the issue guide helps control the range of things that might come up in the discussion. I will say that in some of the subsequent dialogues that we've done, we have compressed the time frame into, in one case, we did some elections or voting and elections dialogues, I think over the span of 2 weeks, right before the last election, just, on different, voting and election related issues. And the childcare dialogues that we just did were all done within the span of a month. So I do think that, the point you're making is a really interesting one. But I think it's more likely the who's in the room on any given day that's driving the level of support or opposition for a particular topic than it might be the external. But I bet it would be so fascinating to redo these dialogues with a totally different panel right now. I wish we could do that and see how their responses might compare to those that had done these dialogues last summer. Now, item.
If I can piggyback off of what Sharon was just saying about who's in the room, I attended most of these dialogues personally, excuse me, and just anecdotally, the two that had kind of the most kind of the loudest, more conservative voices, to be honest, also had, in one case, a current dreamer, and someone who had gone through the whole immigration process of 14 years or whatever. And those two individuals educated the entire group much more than we did with our issue guide, honestly. And I heard verbally, I don't know how it was reflected in their survey results because that's all anonymous, but I heard from everyone, gratitude and thanks. And I never knew that, dreamers are paying into Social Security and they're not getting it back, or you have a teaching license in your country and you're not authorized to teach. There was just the individuals in the room, just to reinforce what Sharon said, it makes a big difference.
Thank you. I would love to see more research on that. I mean, to me, that's all about kind of controlling the message too, what the information they have, but that's super cool. Thank you so much.
We have another question in the chat by, there's not a first name here, but it's MRRPC. Would you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Certainly. This is Ken Harwood at Mississippi River Regional Planning Commission. Sorry, that's just the way it logs me in.
Again.
My question is, and it's really a seed for a discussion topic that goes beyond the scope of this meeting, but I am wondering with this initiative from the president to deport and then bring back immigrants, could we use our legislative contacts to draft an alternative to that policy that might look like, I guess we would allow an adoption policy where a dairy farmer could identify an employee who could remain anonymous so that they wouldn't be in fear of deportation for working with the farmer, but as undocumented but needed for production. Then this person could be granted a temporary work visa, so they would be here legally, and then a long-term opportunity for citizenship or a more permanent work visa. It's a huge topic, but I'm just wondering if it's worth bending some ears, especially coming from Wisconsin, knowing that there are 70% of all our dairy workers are undocumented aliens. So just a thought.
Well, I guess one thing I would say about that is that related to that topic, and obviously we don't take positions on public policy issues, but in the dialogues themselves, there was a lot of tension between individuals who really were wanting to, remove unauthorized immigrants from the country, with recognizing that they are the backbone to supporting many agricultural industries. And how you resolve that tension between needing individuals to work in agricultural roles at the same time, having a policy view that individuals who are here in an unauthorized way should be removed, that's a fundamental public policy tension. And you can see on this particular slide that I'm showing now, there was not a lot of support across the dialogues for the idea of prosecuting employers, for example, if they hired workers without legal status. And that was the lack of support was really being driven by a recognition of the need to have individuals to do a lot of the work that needs to be done to keep farming industry going.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but despite the large number of immigrants that we have, and we guess we don't know how many are unauthorized in Marathon County, we haven't had a lot of ICE activity up here. Have you noticed that? You got to ask why. Why is that? Right, exactly. Thanks, Lori, for your hush sign. So I would love to ask your question, Ken, to people like the National Milk Producers Federation or other ag associated groups that, just find out how are they threading the needle, or maybe they're not. I don't know. I'd love to ask that question. I think there's another important question though from Alex.
Right.
So will the dialogues be sufficient to help people unite behind actual political agendas that they can implement in their communities and present to their politicians? So we have to really come clean on this, that our goal for this experiment wasn't to actually start to put together policy briefs or results, to advocate a certain policy. Not only is that not really in the nature of what our organization does, but we really were hyper-focused on, could this be a vehicle for bringing people with diverse viewpoints together in civil conversation and to create maybe an alternative narrative, right? When we have a situation where people are at odds maybe the press has been involved and magnified those differences. Can we have, my observation is that there isn't a third narrative, there isn't, or a second narrative, whatever, there isn't another narrative out there. Can we create one by having a panel of residents ready to talk about controversial topics that could influence politicians now, or local leaders? I don't know fully the answer to that, but that's kind of a bit of our next phase, is now that we've kind of gathered this data, had this experiment, and we have been in communication with some of the leaders in Marathon County, for example, but we plan to do kind of an event involving them, and we're still trying to decide exactly how we want to involve them and really see if they're interested in continuing the capacity to have these kind of conversations when circumstances are difficult. Theoretically, and I know in some cases the answer is yes to your question, we just did not take it to that next step.
Well, I had a question regarding that related to Alex's question, which is you've got this big cohort of people now that you've engaged with very successfully. What do you do with that group of people? Are there further dialogues? Are there ways to make that sustainable in some fashion? What does that look like? Or is that just part of what you're trying to figure out?
Yes, and both. So, yeah, we are, because we still have one more round of dialogues, we've given ourselves just a little bit of a breather space, but we plan to do some kind of a concluding event, and we just haven't decided exactly what it might look like. And it might be a small series of events. For example, we've thought about bringing together some of the elected leaders to have them actually go through one of these type of dialogues so they can experience what it is, as well as present to them, sort of the results of what we found here, and hopefully try to convince them. I have had conversations with, for example, with our county executive, and he was very interested, for example, in the results of our youth mental health report, because they had just established a youth mental health commission. And so they were very anxious to know what the people had said. And so we're going to try to convince them that they can have this kind of, how do I put it, results or expressions of opinion in a civil manner, really on any topic that might arise. And I'm with you, wouldn't that be valuable, to community leaders to know how people are really feeling about issues before they, plant their stake in the ground, which often happens before people really know what others think. We're also in conversation with some local foundations to see if they would see the positive value of return on investment of supporting something like this. Hopefully, we can also figure out a way to keep costs a little bit lower, because, like I said, when we were giving out $100 a pop, that's definitely adds up very quickly. Those are some issues that we're grappling with or trying to resolve.
Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to add just to the piece of your question, David, about what to do with these 94 people. They are going to be they already are our greatest spokespeople. Like I did not expect this when we started this, how enthusiastic and how grateful all these folks would be from across the spectrum. We're creating a video right now that's kind of like summarizing what we're doing. We've identified a few people to be in that video. I know everybody's going to want to be in it. So they can get the word out into their, organizations that they're part of that might benefit from a process like this. We held an event that had nothing to do with Let's Talk last week it was a religion topic. And there were some pastors afterwards who were talking to me and just started talking about what a difficult time they have in their parishes to deal with people of opposing viewpoints, and they don't know and they actually, one woman even said, I would love to have some kind of workshop or some tools to be able to deal with these conversations. And I was like, let me get you on our email list, and let me talk to you about this project. So, I also am hoping that some of our, the group of 94 will themselves want to be trained as moderators so that they can be out and, doing this work, so that this work can happen in our community, but that it doesn't always have to be centered on whips and us making it happen.
Yeah, quick other note. We connected with someone at UW-Madison at the La Follette School, Amber Wachowski, who also has been doing a project over in Eau Claire. And interestingly, she's using a different methodology, but it's a citizen-based methodology called citizen assemblies. You've probably heard of some of this. And they're working with, I believe it's their county, it might be the city, I'm sorry, I don't remember which, to have some participatory citizen participation in some of the budgeting. And that's something actually the local county administrator at Marathon County also asked about. Now, that's fine with us. Like I said at the outset, deliberative dialogue is just one methodology. It is certainly not the only one. There are many other healthy, helpful civil dialogue tools out there, and citizen assemblies is another example of that.
All right. Well, great. Any other questions from anyone?
I'm just going to make a quick note, David.
I was just going to go to you, Sam.
Yeah. Well, on this point, again, I just want to thank you all for presenting this. And I really agree that there is so much great work like this happening across the state. And I'm just going to put in the chat, the next meeting for WisACT, we already have in the works. And one of the things that us at the Whitburn Center wants to do over the next year is to really connect with, but highlight all of the work that's happening across the state. So our next event is going to focus on UW students and how they're doing this same work, both leading it as facilitators, but also participating in similar dialogues. And so we'll be having folks, students and kind of faculty and staff organizers from Bridging the Divide, which has been supported by the Thompson Center, but also the Pluralist Lab, which WIPS helped organize as well. So WIPS is doing a ton of great work on that front as well. So we're excited to kind of feature some of our students to talk about their experiences within this space as well. So just wanted to share that.
That's fantastic. And you can see why Scott and I are so excited that Sam and her team are running WisACT. So thank you very much. If there's nothing further, thanks for your time and thanks for all the great work you're doing up in Marathon County. And thanks to all our WisACT members for being here with us today. And have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.